Thank you. Fisker Magoo, biggest fighter in Cymru. I'm still looking out a lot with Fisker. You might think it's the language of the gods, but we have the language of the Garden of Eden in Scotland, so there you go, we can play that card as much as we want. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to continue in Gaelic much as I would like to, but there are two words at the start of the presentation which are quite relevant to what I'm going to be talking about. The Gaelic name for Shinty is Camanachd. And it all comes from Caman, which is the actual stick. And our principal competition is the Camanachd Cup, so you will hear me referring to Camanachd competitions. And this is the Gaelic TV service, which I'll refer to as well, does this kind of a word for the day when they're doing a broadcast in the evening. They'll put up this on Twitter and whatever. It's partly to bring in learners and people who are unaware of Gaelic context, to give them a feel for the language. So the Gaelic television has been very important, as I'll explain, in the development of Shinty on the women's front. And this is the Gaelic word for women. Bodinlich just means women, and that's, they give a phonetic pronunciation just to help people along the game. This was the second year we broadcast the game live, the Women's Cup final, which is the Valerie Fraser Camanachd Cup final, so that's the Scottish Cup effectively. So they use that and they do it to promote the game as well as the language. So just by way of background, this year is actually the 25th anniversary of what's commonly held to be the start of what we would all refer to as Women's Shinty. And I suppose what I'm going to try and do in 20 minutes is to explain how that 25 years can be important in terms of the theme for the afternoon today, because it is long enough to give us an assessment of something that is within the wider scene of the game of Shinty. I think the wider game is in denial of the history of the women's game, because they will tell you that it was 25 years ago that the women's game started, but what I'm going to prove is that it was actually a good bit before that. So the last 25 years have transformed the women's role, women generally, in Shinty. Previously they were perceived to have been available and useful in purely a social capacity, relegated to the periphery of all the events, and not actively involved in the playing of the game, certainly not. Sometimes in its administration, but not always in its overall profile, except with a few honourable exceptions, which included principally primary school teachers who took on the role of coaches in rural communities. So the game has transformed over this last 25 years in terms of women's participation, whereas we now have, as I've shown you here, for the last 2 years, BBC Alba, the Gaelic television service, has broadcast the game live. I've been lucky enough to be the commentator on that game. I've had a woman co-commentating with me, which is a huge step forward as well in terms of the actual coverage of the game. And to put it in its context, the men's cup final would attract somewhere of the order of 4,000 to 5,000. That's the extent of our game. It's nothing like the Irish game, which will command 82,000. But the women's equivalent is now at the stage where they will attract an audience of around 1,000 spectators. And what they do is they cleverly build in other competitions. You know, they have a whole series of cup finals on the day leading up to the principal event. So I suppose it all really started, the tide began to turn, if I can put it that way, in 1971 or thereabouts, largely due. This is a photo of the cover of what was called, and is still in existence, the Shinty Yearbook. It's basically the annual, which covers the previous or the current year's activity, and then looks forward to the next year. And in 1971, this started. And just to pin the refrain, which we have for "if you can't beat him, join him," in the 1974 edition of the yearbook, what the yearbook did was it gave the Shinty community a voice for once, a public voice where people could come independent of their own clubs and express their views on various things that were happening. And it began to build, and it has built, a huge resource of the history of the game in terms of its wider culture, songs, poems and whatever. But it also galvanised women into taking action and to express themselves in a way they hadn't had a platform for before. And in the 70s, we had articles written in the Shinty yearbook, one of which had this magnificent headline: "Watch out, boys, revolutions in the air as the Shinty widows stage a takeover." And it went on in various, to detail exactly what they were going to do to the men's game in the next 2 or 3 pages. Liz McInnes, who I'm going to refer to later, was one of the forerunners, kind of set the benchmark, was quoted in that particular article as saying, "Many of the men treat us as a joke and are loath to listen to our opinions." And I think that was a full and frank assessment of where the women were in relation to Shinty. Their role was to make the tea, wash the strips, and it would be familiar to most of you in other sports as well. That is what happened, but life changes. Another feature showed a girl in flares. Hands up if you can remember what flares were. Come on, you can. Well, anyway, this girl was shown in the picture. I didn't want to show it, but she was shown wearing flares and carrying a Shinty stick, which was groundbreaking, really. And the headline, or the first sentence of that article was, "The fair maiden's determination here poses the question, who is wearing the trousers?" So there was a bit of hostility and a certain unease. And as I say, this poem was huge, it was an epic. It was about 15, 16 verses long, and I've just taken that quote, "If you can't beat them, join them." It's a very, you'll be familiar with the refrain anyway, but they started to throw their weight about. And this woman here, Liz Campbell, was actually the poet, or the poetess, who penned this whole story, and she was playing at the time Aberdeen Cabinet, the team in Aberdeen. Some of them were trainee teachers. They formed a 6-a-side team, and they turned up for a men's competition, which caused a bit of a storm. Nobody knew they entered, but nobody realised it was a women's team that was coming. So it caused a major brouhaha. But it kind of is kind of a line in the sand about people having to deal with a situation. They called the game's bluff quite successfully. So now, to leap forward, we have this, I suppose it's their definition, their raison d'etre. They have an association, their own women's association, within the men's association. I'll explain some of the tensions involved in that. So that basically sums up what they are and what they do. It's a sport, Shinty is a sport played almost entirely in Scotland. In terms of the women's game, it is really, although the men's game extends beyond that, similar to the men's game, with modified rules, smaller sized pitches and the same equipment. However, its history is significantly different. Social pressures along with the broader game's self-image resulted in a largely hidden history until comparatively recently. So that's a neat summary of where they are. Where they are now is that just yesterday, Uddingston Grammar School, just to complete the geography for you, Uddingston is basically somewhere between Glasgow and Edinburgh. That's as precise as we need to be. It's in the central belt in Scotland, but it has absolutely no Shinty history. But what the men's game, or the wider game, has done now is it's approached it quite cleverly from this system of appointing ambassadors in schools where the game is played. And significantly, just yesterday, Uddingston Grammar School appointed 2 ambassadors to look after Shinty in their own school, and they're both girls, they're both women. So that is a sure sign that right down at the grassroots, Shinty is now accepted into the lexicon, if you want, of Scottish sport, and that it is perfectly normal and natural, acceptable to be a Shinty player. It doesn't really matter where the sex comes into it at all. In terms of the numbers, these are the current numbers. The annual general meeting of the association is in 3 or 4 weeks' time, but intriguingly, they couldn't give me the current season's figures, but this is last year's. So if we assume these figures are basically accurate and may have grown a little, you'll see that the key figure here to spot is the adult female. Having gone from 2015, they had 224 players, virtually doubled between 2015 and 2018. Now that's a remarkable growth area from, albeit small numbers. The growth from 224 to 394, 400 is colossal, and that shows no sign really of slowing down, although that dip was caused by one school dropping out of the system. And the overall baseline figures, you can see that the total number of players in our game is actually less than 4,000. So it's a minority sport by any definition, but the women's sector within that is a very small sector. So you can imagine the kind of challenges they face. The game of Shinty faces enormous challenges in a whole lot of respects, but the women's game within that faces very particular challenges just because of the weight of numbers. But I'd like to argue that now they're more than punching above their weight in some respects anyway. They have their own league structures, I don't need to go through it. They've developed from a very rustic, higgledy-piggledy game, that's a technical term in Scotland, which you won't be familiar with, but it basically was totally disorganised in the 70s. There was no structure, there was no need, because they didn't have teams, but now they have a whole structure of clubs, teams playing at different grades, 20 clubs in all, 36 teams, 6 different leagues, all leading to different competitions, and they have an engagement with Ireland as well. Part of the problem, or the whole problem really, was the kind of perceived masculinity and machismo surrounding the game of Shinty. And I tend not to like the use of the word violence. The word violent and violent seems to crop into reportage of Shinty all too frequently, but I have a great respect for Paul Rouse, who is an Irish sports historian who came on holiday to the Highlands last year and managed to get himself along to a Shinty match, and he summed it up quite neatly here about the culture of masculinity which surrounds the game, and as he points out, across the generations, and that women were marginalised. And then he explains how the thing completely changed. So in the 1990s, teams began to form. So from the 70s to the 90s, there was still this stage of no structure and no form, but it was in the 90s, 1994 in particular, that teams began to form, and then eventually they found, it took them 7 years to find their feet and to find the need for a structure. And in 2001, the Women's Cabinet Association was formed. Interestingly, the first name that was postulated was the Ladies Association, but they didn't like that for obvious reasons, I think. So they bypassed the Ladies Association and came to the title they now have. Why do women play Shinty? Why would young girls, as you saw in the Uddingston picture, why would they take up a game that is perceived to be, and there's no doubt about it, violent in some respects? Which, I could argue endlessly against that for all sorts of reasons. But this was an interesting thing that Paul managed to get from one of the players in Glenurquhart, which is where he was watching. And this lady, Siobhan, was 38 when she started playing, which is quite remarkable in any sport, that you take up sport at 38. And she, I think this captures a large part of the reason why women would get involved at all. Part of it is the need to support a team, part of it is community, and part of it is the sense of culture and heritage of the particular community within which they live, and an understanding of the place, and the connection with the families and the coaches and everything else. And if you look at the very last bit here, I play Shinty for many reasons. One is I love playing, we can understand that. Then the crack and friends older than you, also it's a huge part of the community here, and my son plays, so it's something we do together. Now I grew up, I was born in 56, grew up in the 60s and 70s, went to university in 79, started work in 80. If you had said to me in 1980 that by now we would be having a 38-year-old woman saying this about Shinty, I would have thought you would be fit to be tied and taken away somewhere, really, because it was just beyond belief, and it still is. But sometimes in your researches, and I'd be happy if anyone can help me here, you come across the most unusual things. In fact, I was speaking to somebody, I think he's still there, who played Shinty in school. Was it Leicestershire? It was indeed, there you are, in Leicestershire. I stumbled across this quite recently, which you see the photo, it's from the Leeds Mercury, 1934, October 13, Shinty on the Shingle. And the caption below, girls of the Church of England School at Filey playing Shinty. Quite clear, it's not any variation of the word. It's not shinny or something else, it's shinty. The Scottish form of hockey, okay, that's what people assume it to be, on the beach. Why? I have no earthly idea why that was. I mean, I didn't even know there was a place called Filey anyway. But I looked it up and it's Yorkshire and it's all the rest of it. We need to get our Yorkshire and after this do a bit of research for me. But why would they be called it? Obviously somebody knew what it was, because they've got this link with, you know, a definition that is the Scottish form of hockey. So that is unexplained, but this is part of the hidden past that Shinty as an organisation will deny it as a past, and here's part of it. What about this one? This took me even further. I really got no clue about this one. I mean, I found this on the website, it just popped up under a Google search or something. Loftus Senior School Shinty team in 1938. They're not hockey sticks, if you notice. Not as we know them anyway. Maybe they were. Maybe that's what a hockey stick looked like. Any hockey experts that can...
Yeah, they are hockey
sticks.
Yeah. In the sense that those sticks were produced in great volume, so that schools could play hockey very cheaply.
Yeah, just now, they're what we would call a natural bend, straight off a tree. Yeah. They're not manufactured in any sense.
We've got lots of them in our museum as examples, but that is essentially
a hockey,
hockey.
Yeah, but why would they call it a Shinty team?
Probably, I think because the manufacturers of those sticks, they didn't actually describe them in their catalogues as hockey sticks, they described them as Shinty sticks.
Yeah.
And it probably
because they were supplying Shinty sticks to the Highlands.
Well, possibly, I have no idea.
I would think that's why it is.
The educational supply companies would supply sticks like that, but they would call them Shinty sticks.
And it was precisely because they were cheap.
Yes, and through ignorance.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Not in a pejorative sense, but just strictly because they didn't know. But we would have called these chessies because they were largely made of chestnut. And that's what we were brought up to play with in the 60s when other wood was more expensive. But I'd like, if anyone can ever establish where Loftus is or where that school, I have no earthly idea. So I'll leave that one with you. I did mention the role of, I'm going to flick through a lot of this quickly. I did mention that this is probably from the late 40s, early 50s, from the dress, I've got the date somewhere, but this is the kind of role women had in Shinty. They were very supportive, but actually the more you dig, the more you find women featuring in fans' pictures. It was generally accepted that it was a man's game, but we had wags long before football had wags. I mean, this is quite clearly an organised outing to a this would be a serious, a major match. You can see that they're pretty well dressed, all decked up. I don't know if they're all couples, but the men are quite clearly given their place. They're stuck in the back row. But you know, we come into the 60s and it begins to become a little bit more obvious. The pictures are easier to find. The women are taking a more public role. They're making a bit more of an exhibition of themselves. The one thing they weren't doing, everyone will tell you, was actually playing the game. It was all very fine to do this, take part in this kind of nonsense at a game, or generally speaking, a cup final. As soon as a camera appeared, they would spring into action. But it's all part of the whole getting together. Now, Newton Moor, which is in the central bit of the Highlands, just off the A9, the main road to the north, and they've won the Scottish Cup, the Camanachd Cup, more often than any other team. They just won it recently this year. But the men in Newton Moor Shinty team will swear blind that women never played Shinty. Well, I've good news for them. In 1964, they had a team called the Newton Moor Bells, who formed up as a team to play another team from Oban, some 60-odd miles away. So there was a whole sense of purpose here. They've got the real sticks and everything. They haven't got strips and so on. But when I revealed this to Newton Moor, it was a major surprise. And there was a lot of guys heading in the other direction when I started to challenge them. So they have a really important hidden part of their history. And as it went on, the Newton Moor women started to become ever so much more organised. And what you'll find is that most of these women here, this is the actual Newton Moor strip, same as the senior men's team, the traditional blue and white hoops, you would find that most of these women were in fact either girlfriends or spouses of the players. The very same players who will deny that their wives were playing shinty to the current day. Although it's now quite acceptable to have your daughters and the rest of the family playing shinty. So the whole culture, in probably the most deepest rooted part of shinty culture, this Badenoch area, has gone topsy-turvy, but they're actually only building on something that was there but was under the radar, if you want. So gradually in the 70s, this was one of our greatest players, a great golfer as well, John Fraser, still playing for the Scottish senior team. He was an international hockey player as well, but a teacher, he was a PE teacher. Ian Cameron was a coach. They started coaching primary school teachers formally into how they would coach children in school. So that gave the women a more significant role. Instead of just being a teacher who trained kids in their spare time, they were actually taught how to teach or to coach formally. So in the 70s it was all beginning to happen. And it's the generation which followed this which actually started playing and creating the clubs. What's obvious about that? You don't need to know anything about shinty, but what's obvious about this picture? This is the ruling body of shinty in 1992. There's only one woman. Where's she sitting? I don't mean this unkindly, but she's right on the end of the row beside the disabled person. I don't mean that unkindly, but that is a fact. That is her position. And this guy was actually, he was probably the greatest shinty historian and provided a lot of the stuff we've got in our archives, Jack Richmond. But they were peripheral. They had to fight to be part. And you've got all the blazers and the ties. Look, they're all there. This is 1 year before the centenary of the Camanachd Association's formation. Next year, they celebrated their centenary. Where's Donella Crawford, the woman? She's still down there. She's still fighting. And fair play to her. She's no longer with us, unfortunately. But look at them. All the men and Donella stuck in the end of the row. Why not even for the centenary picture they do not sit somewhere at the top table? It does sum up where they were in 1992 and 1993 as they came into the point where they're just going to have their team. So that's where they were. And this is Liz McInnes who led the charge. Now that's the kind of game, remember I said it was unstructured and disorganised? Bear that in mind when you see current shinty pictures. This is Scotland v Ireland women. They're now playing international or representative matches against Ireland. See the difference? The strips, the organisation, the full bit. They're now effectively equal partners. They produce their own programmes. 2001 was the defining year. I don't want to go through all the detail when they established the association. What did they do when they established the association? They made a man the president. The only concession is they put a skirt on him. I had to do this. Somebody would have said that anyway. He was actually a class piper, and he wore the Highland dress. And he fair play to him. There's not many presidents of sport could actually lead the cup finalists out on a cup final day. So they've got the full panoply now of the branding, same branding as the men's game, just it's changed. They even take the Gaelic into account where they're bilingual. In 2001 we helped them set this up. This is Karen Cameron, who was one of the first presidents. When she got married, not many women would do this on their wedding day, is there? Just shows you the kind of sense of fun they have, and they're actually poking fun at the men's game when they're doing that. Liz Norman, who's now McCall, is the current president. She married a shinty player, wisely, and they're now producing their own shinty team. And interestingly enough, if you go back to 2003, by which time teams were forming, this is Lisa playing. This is Katie Drain, who there are 4 development officers in shinty. Katie is now one of them. She doesn't look after the women's game. She's a woman development officer. And she was also my co-commentator for the last 2 Ladies' Cup finals. So this is where it all started, and it was interesting that these two have been in cahoots all the time. driving the whole thing forward. And Glasgow, again in the big city, not exactly current Shinty playing territory. The one unfortunate episode we've had, if we can call it that, was we had a woman became chief executive of the overall game. I'm afraid that ended badly for all sorts of reasons I won't go into. It was nothing to do, it wasn't the woman's fault, but it was an unfortunate escapade, which I think was as much down to the historical tensions as anything else. The game wasn't ready to have a woman as chief executive, and unfortunately Jill McDonald paid the price. This is Katie. This is the greatest ever Shinty player, Ronald Ross, 1,000 goals. Messi has nothing on this guy. That's the team. They look after the whole country, and Katie there is in the middle of it, running the rest of them. We have 2 women members on the full board. Wendy Chamberlain is standing for Parliament. It might not last long. If she gets into Parliament, she will take off as a politician. This lady here, Liz Bradley, has a daughter playing Shinty. What do you notice about the 2 of them? They're both still playing. Shouldn't speak about a lady's age, but Wendy is 48, I think. Her daughter is playing the same team as well. And Liz is on the board. She looks after the referees now, as part of the full panoply of the game. So they're not far off the takeover. An interesting feature this year was that Scotland on Sunday, one of our leading papers, actually did a feature on Shinty. This is unheard of. This is the first time I'd ever seen it. A national paper picking up Shinty, and they cleverly used the headline Shinty with a she. Even Kirsty Deans played in the first televised cup final on a Saturday. The next Friday she was playing for a football team, Forfar Farmington, on television. So in 2 consecutive weekends, this woman played Shinty live on television and then football live on television. Now she's amongst the top sportswomen in the country. I want finally just to mention this lady here. In Shinty parlance, Roma Fraser, this girl, is laying the stick on her opponent, giving her a whack across the legs. This is a classic block, so it's fine. The thing about Roma Fraser is that Roma now has a very big decision to make, because Roma has just been playing for Scotland under-18 sevens rugby team. So she's having to make that decision. Is she going to stay as a Shinty player? Her father was a legendary player. Or is she going to go down the rugby route? Because they will make her give up Shinty if she goes on at this elite level. So not only are they making their mark on the field of play, we have women refereeing at the top level, and we have legends. We've got umpteen legends who are now being recognised with things like the BEM. So, in summary, over the last 25 years, the whole thing has changed. But what we can't do is ignore the fact that women were there long before the start of the 25 years. What has happened is that they have transformed their own fortunes, and the game has now, not completely, but to a large extent, accepted women as a real part of the game. Thank you very much.